The last time I saw my son-in-law, Gordon Ashby, truly confident was on a Sunday afternoon in late October. Standing at the head of my dining room table, laughing. He had just finished explaining to my daughter why I shouldn't be trusted to sign my own financial documents. "She's 71, Renee," he said. "She doesn't need to be bothered with any of this." He didn't know I was standing in the hallway behind him. He didn't know I had been listening for nearly 3 minutes, and he certainly didn't know what I had already found hidden inside the garage. "My name is Elaine Mosher. I'm 73 years old now, and I spent the first 7 decades of my life being described as gentle, patient, easy. People meant it as a compliment. I've come to understand it was also a warning I gave to the wrong people. I was born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 4 daughters. My father worked for the post office for 32 years. My mother kept the books for a small dry cleaning business 2 blocks from our house. She was the one who taught me that numbers were a form of language, and that people who couldn't read that language were always at the mercy of those who could. She used to say, "Elaine, never let anyone hold the pencil for you." I didn't always listen. I married young, 24 years old, working as an administrative assistant for a small insurance company. My husband, Harold Mosher, was kind, hard-working, and gone too soon. A heart attack took him when our daughter Renee was 9 years old and our son Dale was 6. I raised them alone. I balanced a checkbook every Sunday morning at the kitchen table while the kids ate cereal and watched cartoons. I refinanced the house twice. I negotiated with contractors, managed medical bills, and made sure both my children went to college without carrying more debt than necessary. I knew what I was doing. I always had. But when you're a widow in your late 40s, and then your 50s, and then your 60s, people start making assumptions. They see gray hair and a quiet disposition, and they decide you've become decorative. They stop asking your opinion on serious matters. They start speaking a little slower, a little louder, as though something has slipped between who you were and who they've decided you are. I let that happen. That's the part I have to own. Renee met Gordon Ashby when she was 36. He was 42, divorced once, and in the business of commercial real estate. He wore good suits and he had a warm handshake, and he knew how to be charming in exactly the way that makes your instincts whisper something you can't quite name. I noticed things about Gordon early on. How he spoke over Renee in conversations about money. How he'd smile at me when financial topics came up, the patient, practiced smile of a man waiting for the subject to change. How he always had a reason why certain decisions didn't need to involve me. Renee adored him. That was real, and I never doubted it. Love makes people trust things they shouldn't, not out of stupidity, out of hope. I understood that better than most. They married 3 years after meeting. By then, Gordon had positioned himself as the family's financial anchor. He helped Renee open investment accounts. He advised her on her 401(k). He suggested they put both names on several accounts for simplicity. I watched all of it from a respectful distance because Renee was a grown woman and it wasn't my place to interfere. But I watched. The comments started small. They always do. The first one I remember clearly came at Renee's birthday dinner, maybe a year into the marriage. The subject of property taxes came up at the table. I mentioned something about assessed value versus market rate, something I had navigated more than once. Gordon smiled across the table at Renee. "Your mom's sharp for someone who's never had to deal with the real estate side of things." Everyone at the table nodded politely. I smiled. That's what you do. But later that night, alone in my car in their driveway, I sat for a moment before turning the key. Sharp for someone who, 4 words doing a very specific job. Over the following 2 years, the comments layered on top of each other, so gradually you almost didn't notice the weight. "Mom, Gordon can help with that. He understands this stuff." "Elaine, you don't need to read through all of that. I can summarize it for you. She means well. She just doesn't have the background for this kind of decision." He was very good at it. Never cruel. Never obvious. Just consistent. A slow, patient project of making me smaller in the eyes of everyone around me, including, eventually, myself. I started deferring to him. On questions about my own savings. On questions about my house. On conversations about what I should do with Harold's life insurance, which had sat in a conservative account for years. Gordon began suggesting I consolidate things. Simplify. Let someone with experience manage the complexity. He had recommendations. He always had recommendations. Looking back, I can see exactly when I stopped trusting myself. It happened in pieces, like a road quietly crumbling at its edges while you keep driving down the center, telling yourself it's still solid. The morning everything began to shift, I wasn't looking for anything. I was doing what I do every few weeks, going through a garage to donate things I no longer needed. Harold had been a careful man, and he'd left behind boxes of organized records that I'd never fully sorted. Insurance documents, old tax returns, household receipts. Things I kept meaning to go through and never did. I pulled down a storage box from a high shelf. It was heavier than I expected. When I set it on my folding table and opened it, I found Harold's old files, exactly what I expected. But underneath those files, folded flat and tucked against the bottom of the box, was something that didn't belong to Harold at all. It was a packet of documents I didn't recognize, printed on paper I didn't own, stapled together with a red paper clip. I stood in that garage for a long moment before I touched them. Something in the way they were placed, flat and deliberate and hidden, made my hands slow. I picked them up. I read the first page. The name at the top was mine, Elaine Ruth Mosher. The document was a limited power of attorney dated 14 months earlier. It granted Gordon Ashby broad authority to act on my behalf in matters related to financial accounts, real estate transactions, and investment decisions. I had never signed a limited power of attorney. Not for Gordon. Not for anyone. I turned to the signature page. There was my name, in handwriting that looked like mine but wasn't. The curves were close. The spacing was almost right. But I have signed my name thousands of times over 7 decades, and I know the exact way my capital E leans forward, the way the tail of the R drops. These were copies. Good copies, but copies. My heart did something strange. Not panic. Something colder than panic. It was the feeling of a thing you suspected but never let yourself fully believe suddenly becoming real and visible and right there in your hands. I put the documents back exactly as I found them. Closed the box. Placed it back on the shelf. Then I walked inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink. I thought about calling Renee immediately. I almost did, 3 times. But something stopped me. The same instinct that had been quietly running underneath my years of deference, like a current I hadn't followed. If Gordon had done this, and if Renee didn't know, I would only have one chance to protect myself before he knew I'd found it. And if Renee did know, then calling her first would be the worst thing I could do. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said a word to anyone. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Harold died. I opened my laptop and I started reading. Financial records, account histories, property documents. Everything I could access through my own logins, which Gordon had helped me set up on a new tablet 2 years earlier. At the time, I assumed he was being helpful. I thanked him. Now I understood that he had made sure to be present for every password, every security question, every account access. Helping was the cover. Knowing was the point. I spent 4 hours at that table. What I found was not dramatic at first. Small irregularities. An account I didn't remember opening. A beneficiary designation I didn't remember changing. A statement from a financial institution I didn't recognize, sent to an email address I had never used. Each thing alone meant almost nothing. Together, they formed a shape. The next morning, I called my accountant. His name was Leonard Fitch, and I had used him for 16 years. He was patient and precise, and he did not speak to me slowly. I told him I needed to come in, that I had documents I wanted him to look at, and that I would prefer he not mention the appointment to anyone, including family. Leonard said, "Of course." Sitting across from him an hour later, I watched his expression change as he read through the power of attorney documents. He was careful about it, the way accountants are careful, keeping his face neutral until he had finished. "Elaine," he said finally. I waited. "I want to ask you some questions, and I need you to be direct with me. Always have been." He set the papers down and folded his hands on the desk. "Have you made any real estate transactions in the last 2 years?" "No." "Have you opened any new accounts?" "Not that I authorized." He nodded slowly. "There are records here of a withdrawal authorization from your secondary savings account. The amount is $47,000, routed to a holding entity I don't recognize." I felt the kitchen table feeling again. Cold and still. "When?" 8 months ago. 8 months ago I had been recovering from knee surgery. Gordon had offered to handle my paperwork while I was recuperating. He'd brought things to the hospital for me to sign. Get well arrangements, he'd called them. Administrative things. I had trusted him. I had held the pen and trusted him. Leonard, I said, what do I do next? He looked at me with an expression that told me he'd been hoping I would ask exactly that. You need an attorney. Not a general one. Someone who handles financial fraud and elder law. The phrase landed quietly. Elder law. I had spent my whole life being the person who understood things, and now I was sitting across from my accountant, using the phrase elder law. I didn't let it undo me. I wrote down the name he gave me. Her name was Catherine Voss, and she had an office in a brick building in Kettering, with a ficus in the corner and diplomas on every wall. She was in her early 60s, direct, and she asked me within the first 5 minutes whether I had brought any documentation. I had brought everything I could legally access, printed and organized in a manila folder. She took it from me without a word and read for nearly 20 minutes while I sat across from her and looked at the ficus. When she finished, she closed the folder. Tell me about your son-in-law. I told her everything, not quickly and not emotionally. Methodically, the way my mother taught me, the way you balance a ledger. Start at the beginning, account for every entry. Don't skip the ones that seem small. Catherine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Mosher, I want to be precise with you. I cannot draw legal conclusions from what you've shown me today. But I can tell you that the combination of a forged authorization document, an unexplained fund transfer, and an unrecognized holding entity is a pattern that warrants serious investigation. How serious? She held my gaze. The kind that doesn't stop at a family conversation. I drove home slowly. The October trees were turning along Stroop Road, orange and yellow, and that particular shade of red that only lasts a few days before it's gone. I used to love this drive. I sat at a red light and thought about the first Thanksgiving Renee and Gordon had hosted. How proud she had been. How Gordon had carved the turkey and made everyone laugh and then whispered to me afterward, loud enough for Renee to hear, that I shouldn't worry about the house upkeep, that he'd make sure Renee took care of me. I had thought that was kindness. I had thanked him. The light turned green. Over the next 3 weeks, I lived in 2 registers at once. In the visible register, I was Elaine Mosher, grandmother, and retired church treasurer, attending Sunday dinners, answering texts from Renee about holiday plans, exchanging pleasantries with Gordon at the front door, while he held a casserole dish and smiled his practiced smile. In the other register, I was building a record. Catherine Voss had instructed me carefully. Document everything you can access legally. Do not confront. Do not signal that anything has changed. Let the evidence speak before you do. I had always been good at patience. It turns out patience, in the right circumstances, is a form of power. What I found over those 3 weeks was worse than $47,000. A second holding entity had been registered using my name and a business address I didn't recognize. My name appeared as a managing member. I had never attended a meeting, signed an operating agreement, or authorized any of it. The entity had opened a line of credit. The line of credit had been drawn down significantly. The collateral listed included my home, valued at the current assessed rate, cross-reference to a document I had supposedly signed authorizing it. I had not signed that document. My house, Harold's house, the house where Renee and Dale grew up, had been listed as collateral for a debt I knew nothing about. I called my son Dale that week. Dale lived in Louisville and worked in logistics. He was practical and quiet, and he had never fully warmed to Gordon, not because he disliked him, because he had inherited his grandfather's instincts. Numbers should add up. Things that don't add up are problems, not coincidences. Mom, Dale said when I'd finished. His voice was very still in the way that meant he was working to control it. How long have you known? 3 weeks. And you're already working with an attorney? And an accountant. A long pause. Good. Then, after another moment, I'm coming up this weekend. I told him not to do anything visible. Not yet. He agreed, but I could hear what it cost him. That weekend, Dale sat at my kitchen table and looked through everything I had organized. He didn't say much. He asked 2 or 3 precise questions. Then he closed the folder and looked at me with an expression I recognized from when he was 8 years old, standing at the edge of a swimming pool deciding whether to jump. Mom, does Renee know? I had thought about almost nothing else for 3 weeks. I don't know. What's your gut say? I looked at my son. I think she trusted him the way I trusted him. I think she believed what she saw, and he was very careful about what she saw. Dale stared at the table. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong, and I'll grieve that separately from everything else. He nodded slowly. The question settled between us, and we let it sit there, because some answers can't be rushed. The answer came from Renee herself, though not the way I expected. She called on a Tuesday night, and something in her voice was different from the first syllable. Tight, controlled in the way that means something is threatening to come loose. Mom, I need to ask you something. Of course. A pause that lasted long enough to be significant. Did you sign any documents about the house? Recently, I mean. In the last couple of years? I kept my voice even. What kind of documents? I don't know exactly. She hesitated. Gordon mentioned something about updating your estate plan. But I was looking through some things today and I found a notarization that I don't remember. My pulse was very quiet in my ears. What were you looking through? His desk. Another pause. He's been gone since Thursday. He said it was a work trip to Indianapolis. I called the hotel this morning. He was never there. The room was very still. Renee. I said her name carefully, the way you say a name when you need the person to stay with you. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to sit down if you're not already. She sat down. I could hear the chair, and then I told her everything. Slowly, methodically, the way my mother taught me. All of it. She didn't speak for a long time when I finished. I listened to her breathing on the other end of the line. I remembered the sound of that breathing when she was small and sick with fever, and I would sit beside bed in the dark. Some sounds you never forget. Finally, she said, Mom, I didn't know. I know you didn't. I swear to you, I didn't know. I believe you. A sound escaped her then. Not quite a word. I let it pass. I didn't try to smooth it over or redirect it. Sometimes grief needs 30 seconds before it can become useful. Then she said, What do I do? I had been waiting for that question. Not because I wanted to be in control, because I knew the answer. You come here, I said, and we figure out the rest together. She was at my door within the hour. The three of us sat at my kitchen table. That night, Renee and Dale and me, the same kitchen where I had balanced checkbooks every Sunday morning for decades. Renee had brought the documents she'd found in Gordon's desk. Dale had his folder. I had mine. Between the three of us, we had more than either of us had separately. Renee's hands were shaking slightly as she turned pages. Not from fear, from something that looked more like fury trying to find its shape. He brought documents to the hospital, she said quietly. More to herself than to us. When you had your surgery. He said it was routine things. I remember thinking it was strange timing. But he said the attorneys needed signatures before the end of the quarter. I remembered. I had been on pain medication. I had signed what he placed in front of me. I had thanked him. I thanked him, I said. Renee looked up at me. Something shifted in her face. Mom, I'm going to make this right. I looked at my daughter. We are, I said. That's different. Dale, who had been quiet for most of the evening, set down his coffee cup and said simply, What does Catherine Voss say is the next step? The next step was documentation, verification, and formal reporting. Catherine filed on our behalf with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, with the financial institutions involved, and with the appropriate regulatory bodies. The process was not fast. These things rarely are. Every week brought another meeting, another discovery, another piece of the structure Gordon had built. What emerged wasn't simple. Gordon had constructed something careful and patient over several years. 2 entities registered under my name or with my forged signature. A line of credit secured against the house. $47,000 transferred to an account, connected to a holding company that, when investigators eventually traced it, led to a condominium lease and a series of expenses that had nothing to do with any business. There was a woman named Sandra Tilson, a name I didn't recognize, until a photograph surfaced during the investigation. She was in her late 30s and she had met Gordon at an industry conference 3 years earlier. The condominium was in her name. The lease payments came from mine. I processed that information at my kitchen table on a gray November afternoon, alone. I let myself feel all of it, the betrayal of it, the specific indignity of having my savings turned into someone else's life without my knowledge. I let it sit with me for exactly as long as it needed to. Then I closed the folder and made dinner. Because grief is real, but so is supper. Renee navigated that period with more grace than I expected. Which is to say, she fell apart in the ways you're supposed to. Cried when she needed to, got angry when the anger was useful, and kept showing up to every meeting with Catherine Voss no matter how difficult it was. I was proud of her in a way I hadn't been since she graduated college. The confrontation with Gordon happened through attorneys. Not in my kitchen, not at my dining room table. In a conference room, with people present whose job was to make sure everything said was on the record. I was told I didn't need to be there. I chose to be. He sat across a long table looking smaller than I remembered. The suit was still good. The handshake was not offered. Whatever confidence he had built his life on had been quietly replaced by something that looked more like calculation. The expression of a man running numbers he knows won't come out right. At one point, his attorney said something about good faith misunderstandings. I watched Gordon's eyes move to mine for just a moment, not with remorse, with assessment. Still calculating. I didn't look away. I had spent years deferring to that gaze. I was done. The legal process unfolded over the following months. The holding entities were dissolved. The line of credit was contested. The transfer of $47,000 became a central focus of the investigation. Gordon's attorneys negotiated. Catherine Voss did not accept what they offered the first time, or the second. By spring, this house was clear. The funds were in process of recovery. Gordon faced consequences I won't describe in detail, not because they weren't real, but because they're not the part of this story I care most about. Renee filed for divorce before the investigation formally concluded. She told me the decision felt like something she had been leaning toward for longer than she had admitted to herself. I didn't push her in any direction. I told her I would be present for whatever she chose, and I meant it. Dale drove up from Louisville more than strictly necessary, which is the Dale Mosher way of saying I love you, and I'm worried without having to say either thing directly. I let him fix things around the house that didn't need fixing, and I appreciated every minute of it. What surprised me most in all of this was not the anger, which came and went, and was useful in its season. It was not the grief, which was real and necessary, and had no shortcut. What surprised me was the clarity. Because something had been returned to me that I hadn't fully realized was missing. The spring after everything concluded, I was asked to speak at a women's financial literacy event at a church in Centerville. Just informally, just a few remarks about the importance of understanding your own accounts, your own documents, your own assets. I almost said no. The subject felt too close, too raw, too specifically mine. Then I thought about what I would have wanted someone to tell me 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, when the slow, polite process of being made small was already well underway, and I didn't have the language for it. I said yes. I spoke for about 20 minutes. Practical things mostly. Check your own accounts regularly, not someone else's summary of your accounts. Know what you have signed. Keep copies of your own documents somewhere only you can access. Understand that phrases like, "You don't need to worry about that," are not always kindness. Afterward, a woman about my age stopped me near the coffee table. She had white hair and very direct eyes, and she looked like someone who had spent a long time being careful not to take up too much room. "My husband manages all of it," she said. "I've always just let him." I looked at her and thought of my mother with her dry cleaning ledgers and her sharp pencil, and her voice that I could still hear, 40 years later, more clearly than she probably knew. "I understand that," I said. "I did too." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it too late to change that?" I thought about Harold's garage and the box I'd almost not opened. I thought about Leonard Fitch across his accountant's desk. I thought about Catherine Voss and the ficus in the corner, and the morning I sat in that office and said the words I needed to say without flinching. "No," I told her. "It's not." She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her coffee cup and looked a little less like someone apologizing for standing in a room. I drove home along Stroop Road that evening. The trees were beginning to bloom again, that particular pale green that only lasts a few days before the leaves fill in, and you forget how it looked when everything was just beginning. There is a version of this story where I end with Richard. With Gordon, where the conclusion is about what happened to him, what he lost, what the investigation found, what the judge said. That version exists. I lived it. But that's not the part that changed me. The part that changed me was a garage in October, a box on a shelf, documents I wasn't supposed to find. And the moment I held them in my hands and felt, underneath the shock, something else. Something I recognized from 30 years of Sunday mornings and ledger columns, and raising 2 children alone, and refusing to let the bank own the narrative of my own life. I recognized myself. My mother used to say that numbers tell the truth. She was right. But she also meant something larger than numbers. She meant that the truth is always there, patient and waiting, in the documents, in the details, in the accounts that don't add up. You just have to be willing to hold the pencil yourself.